Good evening, everybody. My name is Garnette, Oluoch. We've just been introduced, and it is my privilege, my pleasure, and a great honor to moderate this distinguished panel this afternoon. I am the Nairobian, so it gives me great pleasure to welcome both of you to my city, to Nairobi. And so I'll start by giving a more comprehensive introduction of the panelists, just so you get a sense of who they are before we move into the panel proper. Now, Panashe Chigumadzi is an award-winning writer, historian, and professor of African history. She received her MA in literature from WITS in South Africa and a PhD from Harvard. She's the author of These Bones Will Rise Again, which was published in 2018 and sits, where did it go? Ah, over there, that's the book. That's the book. And that's a historical memoir reflecting on Robert Mugabe's military ouster through the spirits of anti-colonial heroine Mbuya Nehanda, whom you will hear about more today, and her grandmother, Mbuya Chigumadzi. It was shortlisted for the Alan Paton Prize for Nonfiction. Her debut novel, Sweet Medicine, was published in 2015 and won a literary award as well. Her first play, Song and Buried, will be staged at the Edinburgh International Festival in July of this year. Now, she was the founding editor of Vanguard magazine, a platform for Black women coming of age in post-apartheid South Africa, a columnist for the New York Times, and contributing editor of the Johannesburg Review of Books. Her work has also featured in publications including The Guardian, The Washington Post, Boston Review, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Die Zeit, Chimurenga, The Sunday Times, City Press, Africa is a Country, and Transition. Please join me in welcoming Panashe Chigumadzi, please. Yeah, I'll give her a round of applause. Yeah. Now, our second panelist, I will actually introduce by way of one of my very, very favorite critics, Edward Said. But he is a Maltese-American journalist and a cartoonist from Portland, Oregon. Now, the book Palestine, which you can see over there, is Palestine over there? Oh, Palestine's not here? Shoot. Okay. Anyway, there's some of his books there, but one of his major books just now, Palestine, is a record of his own journeys around Gaza in 1991. Now, one of the interesting things, of course, for me about you is that you first published it in about 30 years ago, but because of the problems that erupted since last year, this book, of course, is now kind of in real demand, just to explain to people what's happening over there. Now, Edward Said, the Palestinian-American academic and critic, said in his introduction to the book, with the exception of one or two novelists and poets, no one has ever rendered this terrible state of affairs better than Joe Sacco. And why I was using Edward Said, of course, was because he was Palestinian, displaced from home, became, through Cairo, became American, and then a professor at Columbia, and spent the rest of his life fighting for his homeland, Palestine. Now, in the foreword to Palestine, Edward Said refers to Gaza, the national inferno. If you pay attention, therefore, you will note the scrupulous rendering of the generations, how children and adults make their choices and live their meager lives, how some speak and some remain silent, how they're dressed in the drab sweaters, miscellaneous jackets, and warm hatters of an impoverished life on the fringes of their homeland, in which they have become the saddest and most powerless and contradictory of creatures, the unwelcome alien. And this he was writing before what we've just been watching on our screens the last month. You can see this all, in a sense, through Joe's own eyes as he moves and tarries among them, attentive and aggressive, caring, ironic. And so his visual testimony becomes himself, so to speak, in his own comics, in an act of the profoundest solidarity. And Said concludes, Sacco's art has the power to detain us, to keep us from impatiently wandering off in order to follow a catchphrase or a lamentably predictable narrative of triumph and fulfillment. And this is perhaps the greatest of his achievements. And that's in the foreword to the book, Palestine. And so please join me in welcoming Joe Sacco to this panel. Okay. And so, after, I'm still breaking out in goosebumps, when I consider the panel. But, just to get us started, I wanted to start with you, Chigumadzi. And what I wanted to ask you is something to do with Zimbabwe. We sometimes assume that the first wave of African independence, that's from the 1950s to the 1960s, was almost uniform, and forget why independence in Zimbabwe, which only happened in 1980, even as I say that, I realize we've got a lot of young people in the audience for whom 1980 is a long time ago, but for me, it's very recent, okay? And, was such a long time coming, okay? Now, 1965, for me, marks one of those moments where Ian Smith declared, independence, unilateral independence. And so what I wanted you to actually just help us to understand, was maybe some of the impacts of this declaration by Ian Smith, before I go into the next question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, right, okay. Thank you so much, Garnette. I'm really happy to be here, and to the festival organizers, thank you so much, Joe. It's really been wonderful to be in the space of communion, given everything that's happening in Kenya, but really across the world right now. The flight that I was supposed to have taken was going through Qatar just the day before. Was it the missiles that were being directed there? And so you get the sense that there is no way where we are not in trouble right now. Kenya has what it's dealing with right now. I'll go back to South Africa. South Africa has what it's dealing with right now. The United States, as a particular kind of center of empire, is where I was coming from just now. And we're really in a moment where we're living under, or we're seeing the weight of the hypocrisy, or the hollowness of many of the liberal institutions that have made the post-war liberal international order, that is post-World War II, the kind of order that world made at that time, the kind of promises that were made by the West and the institutions that upheld those things are really under serious strain right now. And of course, thinking about questions like Palestine right now is one serious litmus test for so-called the rules-based international order. The fact that Kenya right now, young people are uprising and thinking through and demanding a better future, and as we spoke about yesterday, with a particular kind of historical consciousness, which is really wonderful to see and really moving for us in the very different context that we're thinking through and the context that we're moving through. So this is all just to say that I'm really happy and really privileged to be here in this particular moment, and of course to close out this conversation and to have this conversation with you, Joe, given the kind of work that you're doing, is really important. And so the question that you're asking me around, UDI, as we called it, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, in Zimbabwe in 1965, that was, the settler colony deciding unilaterally as and against the kind of, just 5 years before that, we had 17 African countries gaining independence. So that was the year of African independence. But really across Southern Africa, that was the recalcitrant white settler regimes, whether sort of the Portuguese regimes or the British regimes, that meant that they were holding on to, or unilaterally holding on to power as against the demands of the indigenous black majority. Now, of course, just to speak about the fact that I grew up in South Africa, I also am in the United States, so I want to connect that around this question of independence and in terms of thinking about these rules-based international order, the kind of institutions, how they respond to those questions. Zimbabwe only gained independence that was recognized by the rest of the world in 1980 after a very brutal independence war, the second Chimurenga, as we call it, that was really through the 1960s, late 1960s up until the 1970s, which was ultimately not won by the barrel of the gun, but really ultimately through negotiation and the negotiated settlement. So we then had flag independence in 1980. So I think that's also important to say. That was flag independence in 1980, just like many African countries through that wave of decolonization or so-called decolonization gained flag independence. South Africa, where I grew up, had already had the 1910 Union of South Africa, which was a republic, the bringing together of the Boer and British colonies, and they are independent of the mother country. So i.e. the UDI is the settlers claiming independence from the metropole or the mother country as against the demands of the indigenous peoples. And that's also what happened in South Africa with the Union of South Africa, where there is the unification of the Boer and British colonies as a way, or as it relates to the mother country, but that excludes the indigenous people. But why that becomes quite important is that, and we're also thinking about the United States, where you're from, we have the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but again, the question of independence from who? It's independence of the settlers as against the independence of, or the liberation rather, of the indigenous peoples. And I'm saying this to think about, or what exactly are we conceptualizing as freedom, particularly because we often have ways in which the liberal imagination captures how it is we're meant to think politically about questions of freedom, questions of liberation. So independence in and of itself is seen as a good, but we're not always thinking critically, is this flag independence? Does this mean sovereignty, for example? So in my country, Zimbabwe, where these things become quite important, the land question, just like South Africa, you can have democracy. South Africa is often spoken of as one of the best democracies in the world, the best liberal constitution in the world, but what does that actually mean for the indigenous people of that country? We talk about places like Palestine. People will speak about the idea that Palestinians are fighting for equal rights within the settler state of Israel. That might be contested. Are they fighting for equal rights, or are they fighting for land, for example? And those kinds of questions become important when we think about these or the rules-based international order in terms of what is reasonable to struggle for. And what I mean by what is reasonable to struggle for, many of you would know, for example, that at Nelson Mandela's funeral, President Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia spoke about the fact that the frontline states had asked Robert Mugabe in the 1980s to delay the land reform program in South Africa so that it would not undermine global support for the anti-apartheid movement. Why do I raise that? That is saying something very specific about what is reasonable to struggle for. Yes, it is fine to call for a struggle for democracy, a struggle for equal rights, enfranchisement, but as soon as you start talking about land, it becomes a problem. That is not something that is acceptable within the rules-based international order, of which the likes of the UN are important, right? So you have the Apartheid Convention that's already in 1973, and so Britain can say, right, and can condemn the Rhodesians for the Unilateral Declaration of Independence because you're excluding Black Zimbabweans or Black Rhodesians from the vote. But as soon as the Rhodesian or the black peoples who have fought the war in the name of land, in the name of our ancestors, not necessarily for one man, one vote, as soon as that happens, it becomes a problem when people start speaking of land. And I think about that in the question of Palestine, where often we'll speak about it in terms of segregation, we'll speak about it in terms of apartheid, but as soon as you begin to speak about indigenous people's sovereignty, then it becomes a problem. And we can speak a little bit more to this, but I just want to frame this question of independence and some of the things that are really important within the liberal imagination: independence, votes, voting rights for everybody, égalité, fraternité, you know, those kinds of ideals, which are not always speaking to the demands of indigenous peoples. And those are some of the tensions that we're dealing with in this particular moment, where things that people are truly struggling for are often captured within a liberal imagination. And I'll end off with, I don't know if Mumbi is here. Mumbi Kanyogo wrote a really, really great piece in Substack speaking about how liberal discourse has captured some of the discourses here around good governance, for example. What are young Kenyans fighting for? Is it good governance? Is it for better roads? No, but that was what might actually sound better internationally. Is it because they want voting rights? Is it just about Ruto? What exactly are people fighting for? And very often the liberal international order wants to have a stranglehold around and circumscribe our political imagination so that we don't think beyond equal rights, good governance, water, sanitation. There's a much greater and richer political imagination that we can think to beyond just questions of independence, flag independence, democracy, enfranchisement. And I think that's what the UDI moment helps us to begin to think about a little bit more.
Wow, thank you, thank you. Now, yes. Now, before I bring in Joe, I just wanted to remind us, of course, because we are in Nairobi, we're in Kenya, that the history of Kenya is not much different from the history of Zimbabwe in the respect of the whole 1963 settler and land. Because, of course, I know we are aware that Lord Delamere actually went to London to negotiate a unilateral declaration of independence. But because historical circumstances worked at that moment against that negotiation, I think there was the change of party, then there was that wind of change that was blowing, and in Kenya, there was the Land and Freedom Army agitating on the ground. Some of you know it as Mau Mau. So when she talks about land, we are very, very much in that same plane. And every time I think 1980, and then I remember 1963, these are accidents of history, I think, that we should not take for granted. So thank you so much for broadening and helping our understanding with that unilateral Declaration of Independence. But the settlers did try it here as well. And now just to, and we will come back to a lot of those things, but I think just to bring Joe in, Joe, I wanted to say, you're Maltese-American, that's, your origin is Malta. What drew you to the question of Palestine? And I'm framing this hugely, the question of Palestine.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being here, and really thank you to the organizers for bringing me here, because this is a huge education for me, being here. And of course, thanks to Garnette and to Panashe. Well, I grew up thinking that Palestinians were terrorists. And that began to change in the early 1980s when Israel invaded Lebanon, and their army went all the way up to Beirut, and the Israeli army surrounded a refugee camp, Sabra Shatila, and their Christian allies went into the camp and massacred Palestinians, hundreds of Palestinians in cold blood. And that went on for 3 days, and the Israeli army would turn back anyone who was trying to get out. And I remember seeing the photographs in Time magazine and thinking, oh, wait a minute, I thought the Palestinians were terrorists, so what's going on here? And I had to interrogate that. And by that point, I had already graduated from the University of Oregon with a degree in journalism. And I began to interrogate journalism and American-style journalism. And I realized that every time I'd read the word Palestinian, every time I'd seen Palestinians on TV, it was in relationship to the word terrorism. I mean, every time. And I was not paying attention to the issue particularly. I realized it was almost osmosis. It had just filtered through by listening with one ear to the TV or scanning the headlines. So I began to think about that and slowly educating myself. And actually interrogating, as I said, American-style journalism, which I had been taught and I thought was the gold standard. So later, I mean, it took a long time. There wasn't much I could read at that time. There was books by Edward Said and by Noam Chomsky and a couple of others, and I basically read that stuff. I lived in Europe for a while where people had a bit more of a nuanced attitude. And at some point I thought, I need to go and see this for myself. And I realized, now I realize it was kind of like an act of penance. That, you know, the fact that I thought that a whole people were terrorists, I didn't know any of the backstory. Yes, it was true that on this day, at this time, Palestinians had fired Katyusha rockets from Lebanon into Israel, and that Palestinian commandos had taken a bus captive and killed some people. But I didn't know about everything else that was going on. I didn't know what Israel was doing to the Palestinians, and I had no understanding of the backstory. I didn't know about the Nakba, the catastrophe when Palestinians were expelled from their land. So that's how I got involved in the issue. And that's, it's become a very, in some ways, this is a strange thing to say, my signature issue, because I went back after doing one book and did another book about Gaza in particular, and I've returned to the topic, of course, with what's going on in Gaza now. I mean, there's no choice.
Oh, I think it's on. Yeah, it's back on. Thank you very much for explaining that context. Now, Panashe, I think I'll bring you back just because in your book, where is it again? The particular book, you can put it over here so the people can see it. Yeah. Now, in this particular book, these bones will rise again. Panashe uses a phrase that I really, really like from one of my favorite writers, Aikwe Yama. We are not a people of yesterday. We are not a people of yesterday. Now, your work, like we said in here, is an exploration of Mbuya Nehanda and the spirit of the first Chimurenga, which was in 1890, that she infused or underwrote. Now, the question I'm asking, and I'm asking this in this broad context, you know, where we have the Gen Zs happening right now in Kenya, are there any benefits in the present to looking back at these arguably distant pasts? Are these pasts actually distant? And ultimately, what is the hope that we find there? Yeah.
Thank you. You know, the book was actually a commission. Those of you know Ella Wakatama had asked me, yes, Ella. Ella had reached out to me after the coup, not a coup, and she said, well, you know, I would really love your perspective as a so-called born free, I'm saying so-called born free, which is a term that is used in Southern Africa's settler colonies, Zimbabwe, South Africa, this idea that you're born after independence, after apartheid, or around the time of its fall, and you're born free of history. So the idea being that Mugabe is, you know, this is 30 years of his rule, you don't know anything else other than Mugabe. What is this moment of his leaving ago? And there's a particular mythology or this idea or political mythology that is very much part of what allowed the so-called democratic transitions from white minority rule to black majority rule, that, you know, the old will die and the new will be born, and everything will be okay, simply the passage of time. And so even with looking towards Mugabe and finally leaving, that if we just get Mugabe to go, everything will be fine. And we see that in many different places where we just have this kind of hope in young people, which I think is really important, but I also think there's a particular kind of coloniality around pinning the hopes of a people on a single generation. When I worked on the book, part of what was really important for me was to think through what is Chimurenga, the word that we use for revolutionary struggle in Zimbabwe, and thinking about, and particularly because of the way in which ZANU-PF, and I'm sure you have the similar kind of thing here in Kenya, how the liberation movements would have used history in a particular kind of way, as a particular kind of bludgeon. It means that many of us will then decide, well, actually, we're not interested in history, we're just simply looking towards the future. And then, so it becomes a kind of way, and with a lot of our politicians, with a kind of neoliberal imagination, it's all about spaghetti junctions, we're gonna have bullet trains, and that's sort of the extent of a political imagination. So Mugabe is gone, we're gonna have bullet trains, we're going to have spaghetti junctions, and that's really the extent of it. As opposed to, and that's also what allowed the opposition at the time as well to evacuate the politics of land, for example, to make that simply a ZANU-PF issue, as if land was not something that our ancestors, our grandparents, our parents had fought for, and that being something that we continue to think about. And so thinking about people like Mbuya Nehanda or spirits like that was to understand what is the ethic of struggle, what is an intergenerational mode of struggle. So i.e., it might be that young people are the ones who are physically on the front lines, but they're working in tandem, and as I said at the very beginning of this conversation, that with these young people in Kenya, I do not believe that they're working, and at least from what I've seen and what I've heard, it's not that they're working with just their view to the future. It is a historical consciousness that is moving through them, that is working through them. You cannot do this kind of work without having a deeply rooted sense of the history that you're coming from in order to fight for the future. Those things have to work together. So it is always intergenerational struggle. And thinking about the context in South Africa, where we see the so-called born frees are the ones who then will then call for roads to fall, speak about the symbolism of statues or colonial statues, but also speak to the material conditions, the material reality of the continuedness of landlessness, for example, the continued condition of black people, that this democracy or the negotiated settlement that we speak about has not delivered freedom for black people. This is not what our ancestors fought for. And for me, part of what I've always been interested again in this political imagination, historical consciousness, is speaking to, well, what did my grandmother fight for? When they decided to go to the Pungwes or to cook for the comrades or to go and hold a gun themselves, what exactly were they fighting for? Because very often, as I was saying earlier, we're shoehorned into a kind of liberal imagination that is compatible with a global order. But if you actually ask people, in whose name or what are you fighting for? I know if you ask my grandmother what you were fighting for, we're fighting for the return of the land. The question of one man, one vote, not really. Thinking about the fact that this land, and that's what I speak to in these bones, in that time, speaking to my grandmother and saying, well, where did you grow up? And finally hearing that actually we were forcibly removed, were displaced. You look at that really beautiful piece of land that one settler owns, all of our families were moved, and that's really what set us on fire and allowed us to go and fight. So when it's then circumscribed into just a question of, well, now you have the ability to vote, that really is a shrinking of the historical consciousness. And so part of the work, Joe was speaking about that earlier, even around what I argue as, and in a broader context, when we're thinking about things like Palestine and this particular moment, where there's a huge, there is a great invocation of apartheid as an analytic framework. And I argue that it is an over-representation of apartheid as the object of struggle, i.e. apartheid as thought of as the end of segregation, equal rights. But if you have a historical consciousness about what people have fought for, particularly in the Black South African context, many people have been very insistent on the fact that we are fighting for land. We are not fighting to, for example, if you were to Google, there's a really great piece that was written in the aftermath of the passing of the great journalist, photojournalist Peter Magubane, and a veteran of the Black consciousness movement, Matata Tsedu, wrote a piece critiquing the fact that people are calling him an anti-apartheid activist. And he said, you know, we are from the Zanyan tradition, we're from the Black consciousness, Pan-Africanist tradition, which is the tradition that I place myself in terms of a historical consciousness that informs the work that I do. He's speaking to the fact that if you were circumscribing this to a fight to desegregate the canteens, a fight to desegregate pools, we're talking about the fact that that pool or that door is on our land in the very first place. How do they get there in the very first place? In South Africa, those of you who follow South African history, we are currently celebrating the 70th year of the Freedom Charter, which then famously argued or put forth the idea, and this is in 1950, in the 1950s, the idea that, or 1955 in particular, the idea that this land belongs to all who live in it. Now, according to a particular kind of liberal and even leftist imagination, that's a fairly uncontroversial statement, but that's really the reason why there was the split between the ANC and the PAC, and why we have those different kinds of contesting political traditions, where they speak about the fact that, well, how did all come into the land in the very first place? This land does not belong to all, it belongs to the indigenous Black majority. And so those are part of the contradictions that come in 1994. And that kind of historical consciousness of the fact that we have been contesting and we have many different political imaginations, historical consciousness about what exactly are we struggling for, what exactly are we fighting for, and those things become very relevant when we're thinking about struggles right now. What is our vision of the future? And how does the historical consciousness of our ancestors also inform that, particularly for people who are indigenous, where we're constantly being shoehorned into what is acceptable within a liberal international order to fight for. It's okay to fight for equal rights, it's okay to fight for desegregation, but as soon as you talk about sovereignty, self-determination, that becomes unreasonable within this kind of order. And having a historical consciousness gives us the ability to think more widely beyond an order that is dying under its own hypocrisy.
Can I say something there?
Oh, yes, sure.
Because I think Panashe has really opened up my mind to a lot of things, just reading an essay by her where she really outlines well the difference between a civil rights struggle and a liberation struggle. And in the Palestinian context, what's considered the most radical solution to the problem is a one-state solution. But in the context of a one-state solution, it's all about civil rights. This is the maximalist position, or the position that everyone thinks is the most radical, but it says nothing about land. It says absolutely nothing about land. And I remember being in Gaza and asking a friend of mine, so what's your position on land going back to your homes? And I said, how much land do you want? And he said, all of it. And you get it. They lost their land. Whatever happened in Europe, the awful things that happened in Europe were basically put on the backs of the Palestinians. And people have a great attachment to land there. A lot of people still hold the keys to the homes they were expelled from. And there's a way that you see it there, where there's a way of damaging the land to damage the Palestinian people. So this destruction of olive trees. I talked to an older man in the West Bank, and someone had thrown a stone at a settler car right outside his house. So the Israeli army came by, this was an old guy, gave him a chainsaw and says, cut down these olive trees. And he had to cut them down. And I said, how did that make you feel? And he said, I felt I was killing my own sons. So that's the attachment to land. But it's interesting that you don't really hear much talk about land. And that was always Hamas's point. Hamas is mostly refugees in Gaza. That's where it sort of grew out of. And their position is to get the land back, which is really a threatening position. It's a threatening position even to Palestinians you know, there might be Palestinians in the West Bank who were never refugees, technically. They might be happy just to keep the status quo. But what we're seeing in the West Bank, I mean, if you never thought it was a settler colonial project before, it is clearly one now, because they are taking over land. They are starting new settlements. The settlers are coming through, attacking villages, and while the army sits back or joins in. And actually Gaza, in one point, is almost remaking the land. I mean, maybe the Israelis are going to make the rubble bloom. I don't know what's in their mind. But they clearly want the Palestinians out so they can take the land.
Yeah, and I think, you know, for us in Kenya, this very question of land, and when I think, you know, one of the writers we're commemorating today, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, one of the issues that he really talks about in his writing is that whole land question. And for him, coming from a place where his family was displaced, they were made, you know, to become squatters on their own land. And what that actually means here is that you're squatting here, but you can see your land over there. And not only that, but you're also working your land. You're now turned into labor on that very same land. And so these are some of the issues that, of course, come up again and again.
Can I just speak to this question of just another example of historical consciousness, just with land, and even just, again, some of the things that we take for granted around everybody must be struggling for democracy or liberal democracy. We're all becoming sort of liberal subjects. You know, particularly one of the most pernicious things that you know, is how the Haitian Revolution is often spoken of. You know, the first Black Republic. You know, Black people are struggling to become, you know, again, the idea that they had seen what has happened in France, and they too also, I mean, because Black people, enslaved people, needed the French to know that they were not free. It's an insult. It's a grave insult to think that I have to be bequeathed the idea of freedom from the French, from the Enlightenment, to know that I am unfree, to know that I should fight for that struggle. And that reduction of the Haitian Revolution, and again, that historical consciousness was really important. You go and have the Haitian Revolution without Boukman and Fatima, all of those figures, those ancestral spirits, those ancestral movements, which are about the transmission of a historical consciousness, which people brought with them from the continent. And so then to shoehorn the Haitian Revolution into, it's simply about, you know, again, this teleology into a first Black Republic, about being a democracy, that's simply not the case, because it's easier and it's more legible for us to understand. You think about Guyana, or what is now Guyana, one of my favorite examples of a historical consciousness that leads to a different imagination of freedom, of liberation, is what happens in the aftermath of the Battle of Berbice. And this is around the 1770s. And what do? Again, it's not about creating a sort of a Black Republic or the first Black Republic. What they do is then create, and this is amongst Black people from across different parts of the African continent, Creoles, people who had recently been African-born, and they create a kingdom that is based on many of the Asante political institutions. They install Kofi as a Santehene. And it's just to say that, look, if liberal democracy is what people want, that's not fine, because this is actually why we're in this mess right now. But part of it is to say that it doesn't have to be this or nothing. And part of it is, you know, it's easier to imagine, and the essay that Joe is talking about is an essay that comes out of some lectures that I did called, you know, Apartheid Isn't the Question, Settler Colonialism is the Question. And the idea, the first thing that I say is that it's easier to imagine the end of apartheid than it is to imagine the end of settler colonialism, particularly when it's around land. You think about America, for example, if you have to have these land acknowledgements, which I absolutely hate. It becomes a very vulgar performance. You know, I stole your bike, but I'm not going to give you back your bike. What is the point of that? And of course, it came from a very radical moment, right? Liberalism and capitalism has a very stunning ability to co-opt and to deaden the most radical of demands. It meant something very important. For example, if we think about the time of Occupy Wall Street, and I think it was in Oklahoma, where indigenous activists had really pushed against, and again, this is also not just the liberal, but also a leftist imagination. They're saying, well, look, you can't speak about Occupy Wall Street when right now our land is being occupied. We have to speak about decolonizing this land. You cannot talk about the end of capitalism if you're occupying. You cannot say this land belongs to all. Whose land was it to be in the very first place? You can't sidestep that question. And that's part of what the problem with the Freedom Charter is. There's a very particular kind of leftist Marxist imagination of the land belongs to those who work it. But we have to ask, how did those who are in that land come there in the very first place? Because it's always that intractable question of indigeneity that we don't quite know what to deal with, at least within a particular kind of Western imagination. The question of indigeneity is always one that is irresolvable by kind of pushing towards a kind of universalism that cannot deal with the specificity and cannot deal with the question of the native. And that's what we're dealing with right now in Palestine, where I'll give you the last example around this question of civil rights versus liberation struggles. I think it was, in the mid-2010s, it was the 50th anniversary of the freedom rides in America. And so we had young Palestinians who had then decided that we're going to, and particularly because in Palestine, what we've seen after the failure of the Oslo Accords and state-led movements towards self-determination and recognition of the Palestinian state, there was the move towards the more legible forms of struggle. So let's use apartheid, let's use the civil rights struggle as the legible forms of struggle that people know across the world in order to appeal to global civil society, right? Reasonable demands. And so these young people do that, and they create or they reflect what they call these civil rights or these freedom rides in Jerusalem and board Israeli-only buses. And there was huge critique amongst Palestinians to say, well, yes, there's a lot of global fanfare around these freedom rides, but this is not a fight to desegregate the buses. This is a fight about the fact that those roads on which those buses are going on in the very first place are on our land. So even with amongst Palestinians, there is that critique of this civil rightsification, and we understand why. We talk about what are the material conditions for struggle, what is possible in terms of a political imagination, but those things are there to think about, well, is this really a struggle to desegregate? Is this a struggle, again, for land? And Palestine becomes the intractable problem of our times because settler colonialism is the intractable problem of our times. Imagine thinking about land in America right now. If we actually had to take seriously indigenous demands, which of course indigenous people do, there will be no America to speak of, which is what many of us would want. But that's really to speak to the fact that it is intractable because we think of it as a scrambled egg. You can't undo the fact that the settlers are here. We're all immigrants. We're all settlers. There's no real indigenous people. My great-grandmother was also an indigenous person, so we're all fine. But no, we have to recognize indigeneity as an important part of what a political imagination is.
It is very difficult to get a word in sideways once Panashe gets going. I've been trying to, kind of getting and thank you for drawing that link.
Do I have a time just
no,
to?
No, just before you do that, yes, you will do that. But I wanted to share some of her words from the book before we totally lose that moment where she was talking about the leadership. And this is on Mugabe. And you know how we wait for, whoever is in power to go. And on Mugabe, she said, the wait for his departure weighed down so heavily on our hearts and minds that it constrained the spirit of radical political imagination that has allowed us to make and remake ourselves time and again over the centuries. In the same ways we limited our political imagination to the end of colonialism with dire consequences for our post-independence years, Mugabe's end represented the end of our political imagination. Now that we are living through Mugabe's end, we will come to understand that Zimbabwe's future is not a matter of the old dying and the new being born. And I keep thinking about that, of course, in our context where we keep saying, oh, no, let the political term end, as if that will, kind of herald the revolution. But those are her words in this book, which I found really beautiful. And now, Joe, please.
And actually, to speak to that particular point, that's what people are saying in America. We're all waiting for Trump to go. Trump is the problem. And of course, Trump is a massive problem. He truly is a massive problem. But is getting rid of him going to change the course of the United States, especially as far as foreign policy goes? Because if you looked at the previous administration under Joe Biden, he was a genocider. I mean, we are completely complicit in genocide. And if Trump carries that through, it's just an American project. But Trump has a sledgehammer way of doing it. So he can further the American project in his tenacious way, where everyone stands back and apologizes to him. But there was something else you mentioned about, I think in the West we tend to look at everything through our liberal Enlightenment lens. And I've been very guilty of this myself. I mean, Thomas Friedman, the awful New York Times opinion writer, once asked, "Where is the Palestinian Gandhi?" And I mean, to be fair, even I've wondered. I've thought. I remember being in Gaza and telling my friends there. I said, "What you ought to do," as if I have a right to say something like this. What you ought to do is collectively march toward the border in such numbers that the world will notice, and the world will be shamed into doing something about this issue. And he looked at me kind of like I was dipped in shit, and he said, "Joe, they will shoot us." And some years later, in Gaza, there was the Great March of Return, where they took my advice. Not that I instigated this, but they actually, in large numbers, marched to the security fence, what's called the security fence, and they stayed for months and were shot down in droves. About 250 people killed, and snipers shooting at people's knees so that there'd be amputations. And thousands of Palestinians were wounded in this way. And after that, I had no more suggestions for what the Palestinians ought to do.
Yeah, and now that we're on that, I just wanted to kind of ask you the last question, because we're running out of time. And, it's been said of your work, that it was a new form, this comic journalism. Now, it was first published, like I said at the beginning, about over 30 years ago now. And yet, after kind of a hiatus, the demand today is remarkable. Now, the question to you is, what do you make of this success? Yeah.
Well, it's actually really sad that a book will get success like this. I think people want to understand some of the background to what's going on. And in many ways, the book is completely out of date. But in many ways, you also see the logic of the system. It was always there. What happened now was always kind of in the womb of what was going on then. So there were home demolitions, people being thrown into jail, people being shot. And I thought it was appalling when I was there. But of course, now what we're seeing is violence on a scale that, I've never seen this in my lifetime. I think most people haven't seen it quite like this. And also unapologetically.
Okay, now I'll turn to Cecil Rhodes and Panashe. Now, former opposition leader and activist Sekai Holland had once told Zvomuya, "Vana Mugabe masvikiro avana Rhodes." Mugabe and his people are the spirit mediums of Rhodes. Now, it was a bold statement to make. Cecil John Rhodes, the arch-imperialist who did not feel it was enough to conquer this land and its people in his lifetime, sought in his afterlife to symbolize the spiritual conquest by ordering his burial at the spiritually sacred Matobos Hills, where our Ndebele, Shona, and Kalanga ancestors and their spiritual leaders communicated with their god, Mwari. Now, the question I'm putting to you is that in 2015, there was that hashtag Rhodes Must Fall at UCT in South Africa, which then spread. Now, the students brought down Rhodes' statue and demanded for the decolonization of education. The question is, how does Rhodes continue to live in the imagination?
Well, the question of Rhodes falling, just thinking about the broader question of empire, that Rhodes symbolized late 19th century empire across Southern Africa. I'll just speak about this right now, actually. Slight segue, but I think it's important just to contextualize. If I'm thinking about someone like Rhodes and how he structures an imagination, a global imagination, a global settler imagination that we're seeing, the sort of settler international that we have right now, where we have, white Afrikanerdom pleading victimhood, pleading genocide. And I think it's an important corollary to what's happening with the actual genocide in Palestine, that they can have a viable claim to genocide because black people even begin to whisper about the land question in South Africa because of a land bill. So the fact, what I'm speaking to is just as the news point, the news hook, being that, 49 or is it 59, the numbers disputed, white South African refugees, so-called refugees, gain refugee status in the United States. There's Elon Musk. We speak about the sort of South African mafia that's in the United States right now. That's really, and what is interesting about this moment is highlighting something that for many people might seem as new, but is a very long history of a global settler imagination, a global settler circuit that we can move from one land to another, and particularly settlers move from one place to another, right? When things go well, for example, I grew up in a place called Mahubaskloof, in part in South Africa, and there's tea estates there. One of the most prominent tea estates there was run by refugees of the Mau Mau revolution here. They had their tea estates there. When things didn't work out there because of independence here, they come down to South Africa, or they came down to Zimbabwe, they come down to South Africa, then they move out. So people like Cecil John Rhodes, he moves from the UK, comes down to South Africa, goes, that kind of circulation is still happening of a settler imagination. But it's not just a settler imagination, because if it were imagination, it would just be something that's laughable and we move on. But it is built, or it's backed by some very serious capital, very serious military power. And that's what we're seeing with this Trump moment, with this idea of what Cecil John Rhodes at that time, and I mentioned that he arises at the late 19th century, this idea, particularly we said the Anglo-Saxon part of the world, this idea of white men's countries. White men are going to disperse across the world, and we're going to, as and against an existing indigenous population, we're going to create white men's countries of these lands. That's in Australia, that's in New Zealand, that's in the United States. It's a very serious political project that is being undertaken in the late 19th century, and it continues to dominate and continues to structure how the world functions. It's part of what happens with Zimbabwean land reform, which was part and parcel. That's exactly why we fought for land. That's exactly what we went to when we went to Lancaster House. Part of the agreement, Tony Blair, who then reneges on it, the idea that, just letting that go past, that we want the return of our land, but the idea that these countries are rightfully white men's countries, how dare you then ask for or demand for the return of your land, right? That's part of the fallout within Zimbabwean land reform in the early 2000s. And then right now, what we're having, when we begin to speak about decolonization, Rhodes must fall, not just symbolically, but materially, particularly around the fact that black South Africans, who are more than 2/3 of the population, own 1% of land in South Africa. Wow. 1%. Wow. And so when we then begin to even talk about a substantive land reform, it becomes, but look at Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
That's the bogeyman. Look at what happened to Zimbabwe. We don't want that situation happening there. But part of also what sustained that fallout in Zimbabwe was that global settler international that says that white property, white bodies are sacred as and against black land, black bodies which are not sacred. That relationship is almost inverse, right? And so we see that with Trump in this particular moment around that particular imagination that when there are actual people being killed, actual people being genocided, the fact that South Africa then goes and puts the genocide case at the ICJ, South Africa is then punished for that, and then we use these white settlers as an example of real victims of genocide. That is part of the imaginary and the infrastructure materially, symbolically, that people like Cecil John Rhodes were able to really cement, because it's actually a centuries-long thing. They were able to cement that in the 19th century, and it continues to structure not just South Africa, and I'm bringing in that global context to say it doesn't just circumscribe what is possible in South Africa alone or Zimbabwe, it really circumscribes what is possible politically across the world.
Yeah, and I think this is what, oh yeah, okay, we can have some applause. Yeah, I was going to say, I think this is what Carol Boyce Davis, in a recent book, I think it was published last year, has spoken about in terms of the circularities of power. But now we really have to open it up to, the people in the room to get, might be a question of two before we totally run out of time. The lights are in my face, so I can't see very clearly. Okay, over there, could we have, and please keep the question very, very brief so we can have a few people. Okay, the gentleman over there.
Hello, my name is Edgardo. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I'm going to be as brief as possible. And this question is to Panashe. I had the chance to go to the school down the road, and I took this class of colonialism with Sana Ayar, and all of this conversation brought me to the last question that she asked, and it was about how can we imagine South Africa post-racialized, and but the answer that I came up with was post-racial South Africa or post-caste India, and the answer that was discussed is that maybe we should move Afrikaners out of the country and think about, okay, well, it's possible. The Idi Amin did it in Uganda, but then she came back with okay, but then where would they go? And that resonated me a lot because I don't know the answer and I don't know where to find an answer. And I was wondering if you, what would you say to that?
Panashe, where would they go?
This concern with what is going to happen with the Afrikaners, they're fine.
Okay. Yeah, they're fine. Okay.
No, and it's a very serious issue. This concern, there's global whiteness which will protect them. Thank you. Yeah. They are very, very fine.
Okay.
And I'm saying this not to be facetious. If you go to Zimbabwe today on an airplane, the vast majority of people on the airplane are young white Zimbabweans. They are living better than they've ever lived before. I was talking about that with someone today. They continue to own the economy. We're talking about circulations of capital, circulations of power. In terms of their material security, in terms of an international that will look after them, they'll be fine. But as we talk about a historical consciousness, when we go back to when we speak about the PAC, talking about an Azania, we are simply saying, and we come from cultures, come from society, we don't have a problem with outsiders coming into our societies. That is not the issue. Coming in in South Africa, we have a long history of shipwreck survivors and that kind of thing who were integrated into communities across the coast. Shipwreck survivors, enslaved people, that is not the issue. The issue is that when you come in as a settler, and that relationship as a settler is around that relationship both to land, is a relationship towards dispossession. They can, there's a piece, I will mention it, there's a piece I've written in the Guardian around Ubuntu and the way in which that has been abused in a post-apartheid South Africa to this post-racial idea. White people can become people in Africa provided they stop being settlers in Africa, and you cannot bypass the question of land and the material dispossession. if you're serious about becoming part of the people, you have to address those questions. You have to go through, you see, part of the huge issue that we have, Black South Africans, around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was no real material or symbolic atonement by white South Africans. You cannot tell me that you want to be part of the people and you own the vast majority of wealth, you control all the wealth, you control all of the land. Until you address that, the question of becoming part of the people is a moot one. So I will not answer when white South Africans say, where will they go, until they address the question of the material spoils as well as the psychic and the generational trauma that they've meted out. Until they're responsible for that, where they will go is not my concern.
Yeah. Panashe, on that note, we are totally out of time.
No, I have one question.
We can continue for a little bit?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. So we can, please, let's try and take a few more questions because, I mean, these are the issues today. These are the issues. Is there over there?
Yes, I'm right here.
Okay.
And I have the mic.
Oh, thank
Yes.
you.
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. And also thank you to both of you. I think you've provided us with amazing analysis of this current situation. So my question is around armed struggle. Because as I listen to you all, I'm thinking, yes, we had this analysis, and we need to do something. But what does it mean for what is happening right now with the protests, you know, fighting the police, or even directly going back to the idea of armed struggle? I'm really curious from you, Panashe, what you've read previous and what you've written, and what we can do in terms of doing that. And for you, Joe, also what it means when Palestinians have tried to use armed struggle, and were there possibilities within that? So that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, I think we might be 2 more questions, and then they'll answer them, and then we can wrap up. Okay, I can see a hand over there.
Hi, my name is Shazia, and my question is for Joe. One was to do with form, which is, you know, you said you were trained as a journalist and then you decided to go down the path of graphic novelist. And I'm wondering what it was that traditional journalism didn't allow you to do, that being a graphic novelist allowed you to do in terms of to tell a story that is as true as possible. Okay. And secondly, you said that you found that there was a bit more nuance in Europe when it came to the question of Palestine. And I'm wondering why that is. Is it because of its, you know, the reconciliation that it partly had to do with its colonial legacy, or was it something else? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And one last question. Okay, over here. Could we have a mic over here at the front, please? Yeah. Could we have a... I can't see the mics. Oh, yeah, there we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk and the knowledge you've shared with us. I was just curious to know what you would think or what you envision like a project that can undo liberal hegemony would look like, especially in the Kenyan context where what can we do to ensure that our movements are not co-opted and derailed towards very narrow demands? So for instance, like the energy, the revolutionary energy that we have seen right now in the country being channeled towards liberal strategies like elections, or in the case of police brutality in Kenya, us being told that all we need is more police reforms as opposed to a more perhaps radical solution like abolition.
I think we can... Shall we start with you and then we end with Panashe? Joe?
Sure. You mean on form?
Pardon?
Oh, start with me on armed struggle.
Yes, because I
Okay.
think it was asked to both of you, and then
Okay.
on your own practice.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
As I said before, I'm just not in a position of giving Palestinians advice on something like that. I think they have the right to armed struggle. I think the question is, what results can they produce from it? Are there other ways of producing better results? And now I don't really have answers to these questions, because you can see the kind of violence that's been visited upon them whenever they have an uprising. I mean, October 7th, you can look at it in a lot of different ways, but civilians were killed. So that's definitely the case. But Israel's response was so great that what is an armed struggle going to get them now? I mean, in a realistic sense, and this is a problem when I think about it. A lot of Palestinians I've talked to, I was in Egypt recently, and they never want to go back. I mean, this is unfortunate. This is sort of new. They really were rooted to their land, but after 18 months of what they've endured, it's not about struggle anymore. It's about survival. And if you have children, you're not thinking in terms of staying put and struggling in any way. Really, the consequences of what's going on now, they will unfold over a long period of time, I think. But armed struggle, I think it works in some contexts. It has worked in contexts.
And your second question on practice?
Oh, about form.
Yes.
I'm afraid I'm one of those people who forgets questions. Oh, okay. So, but what was the basic? There were two parts to that. Do you remember?
Journalist. Why did you? Why did you leave that and become a comic?
The truth is, I became a cartoonist. I got out of journalism, and I wasn't really thinking of putting the two things together. It developed very organically when I wanted to do basically my adventures or my travelogue in the West Bank and Gaza, just talking to people. But when I got there, my journalism training really kicked in, and it became journalistic. So that whole concept developed organically. The advantages to me is that I can draw myself in the books, and I think that's a signal to the reader that everything's being filtered through one person. I'm not a fly-on-the-wall journalist who sees everything, knows everything, kind of a journalism demigod. I'm a fallible human being, and I think that's the importance of drawing yourself into the story. There was another part to that question.
I think that...
Oh, Europe.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't so much Europe as the people I was with in Europe. Now when I see what Europe is doing, my friends in Germany, probably one of the worst cases in Europe now, my friends are aghast at how Germany's approaching what's going on in Gaza, and they say, you just have to keep your mouth shut here. You can lose your job. There's so much pressure not to say a damn thing. So there's definitely a difference between what we're seeing among the youth in the United States and in Europe and what the governments are doing. And this to me shows how undemocratic the European and American systems are at this point. They're just simply not listening to the people. In fact, this liberal idea of freedom of speech, it's being completely crushed at this point. But I think it's being crushed because the narrative that the students understand and are putting across is effective, and it's dangerous to the system. So it has to be crushed.
Okay. Actually, that's an interesting point you make, because I'm going to draw in the question from the young gentleman over there who asked about liberal hegemony and what the youth movement in Kenya can do, because that was your second question, but the first, of course, is on armed struggle.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting coincidence that the subject matter that I keep returning to is war. I now, like the book I'm working on is on the 9 Wars of Dispossession in the Eastern Cape, or what is now the Eastern Cape, and that's from 1778 to 1779 to 1878. So that's the longest period of European military warfare in the history of European presence in Africa. Right, and this happens in South Africa. And again, with this overemphasis, just as a side note, overemphasis on apartheid, that period of segregation, and not thinking about the immense amount of bloodshed and war and violence that long preceded even the question of, do we get to use the same doors or not? There is an entire system of violence that then actually makes and paves the way for the question of same swimming pool, same doors, whatever. But the reason why I mentioned this, having a historical consciousness and really sitting with and studying war across different contexts, but particularly that one, we have 9 wars with many of the same actors or across generations, black people, various groups of black people. So this is the British and the Boers. These are their wars for the land, labor, and cattle of Xhosa or isiXhosa and Khoisan-speaking peoples in what is now South Africa. And that really is what paves the way for South Africa as we know it in terms of settler colonialism and a site of dispossession. And what has been very interesting has been paying attention to strategy, tactics, when we retreat, when we don't retreat, and having to have a particular kind of humility around that. So I will say, first of all, when I think about armed struggle, I often go back to, again, historical consciousness, Nelson Mandela raising a historical consciousness of black or indigenous black political philosophy when they do when he initiates or part of initiating the turn to armed struggle in the 1960s, in the aftermath of Sharpeville 1960. Nelson Mandela says specifically, and he's not invoking sort of Marxist forms of struggle, I mean, although he's working with the Communist Party of South Africa, he specifically says, "Sibatana asibokwe kadiatla," meaning, and which is a Tswana dictum, that the wild attacks of the beast are not averted by bare hands alone. Which is important because the point he's making at the time, particularly given Sharpeville massacre, where black people, unarmed, had been shot, and that really brought the world's attention to the anti-apartheid struggle. Why that was important that Nelson Mandela was coming in as and against, and there's a lot of debate about whether Albert Luthuli, who was the president of the ANC at the time, actually knew, because he was opposed to armed struggle in principle. He was non-violent in principle, which is why part of why he also won the Nobel Prize. And what Nelson Mandela was doing with invoking that Tswana political dictum, he specifically meant that the question of non-violence or violence is not a question of principle, it's a question of tactics. I.e., we're seeing that the weight of, after many decades of doing non-violent struggle, we've reached the point at which we cannot avert the wild attacks of the beast of apartheid or settler colonialism with bare hands alone. Non-violent strategy is no longer going to work for us in this moment, right? And that's a really important aspect that guides me in thinking about various contexts. I can be pro-nonviolence. I'm never not pro-nonviolence in principle. For me, I am pro-violence in principle, in the sense that if there's a violent system that I'm struggling against, violence is something that is justifiable for me, by any means necessary. However, the question then is, does it make sense in terms of strategy or tactics? Because a lot of things we might do because it feels good to fight violently. We might have, and you see again, if you're a student of struggle, student of various revolutionary moments, people will take steps back to say, well, is this the moment to strike? No, perhaps this is a moment for reconnaissance. Perhaps it's a moment for different kind of tactics. When I look at those 9 wars of dispossession, to understand why it is that people get to the point after 9 brutal and devastating wars, get to the point where we're no longer going to fight, we're going to have, so after those 9 wars of dispossession, it takes at least a century really, well, not a century, but 1878 until the 1960s, almost a century actually, before we have armed struggle again. And that makes sense because they understood that we had been militarily defeated in terms of the technology, in terms of their numbers. We simply cannot fight them militarily at this moment. But what it will mean, while we're still understanding that this is war, which is why many of the metaphors people are using, the slogans people are using, Zemkinkomo, for example, which means your cattle have been stolen, but it actually metaphorically means you have to go out to war. That is constantly something people are understanding, that we are still under war, a state of war, but right now this is a point of reconnaissance and retreat to reconstitute ourselves as a people. So I'm saying this in the context of many different spaces where, let's say in Zimbabwe, we have the experience of armed struggle against a settler colonial establishment. Right now, for many of us, we would not say that armed struggle is a viable strategy right now because you will simply be crushed by the ZANU-PF machinery. That's just a fact. But even when you're looking at why that previous, or how that previous generation came to fight, you think about they understand each part of their revolution or their struggle is within a continuum. So we say there's the first Chimurenga, you're fighting against bullets, largely with spears and that kind of thing, or flint muskets, you really are going to lose. And you recognize that, right, maybe it's time, and maybe you often hear in African culture, people will speak about going to learn the witch's witchcraft, for example, which is why you often send the children out to missionary schools, whatever, to go and understand the metaphysical dimension of the settler colonial power. You see that happening all the time. So I'm saying that in this context, I wouldn't know. I don't have enough understanding of the Kenyan context, but I think it's to say that when we think about armed struggle, we think about violent tactics, it is always in relationship to what works tactically, what works in terms of strategy, not from a question of principle, because I do not think that it is, I think it is ethical. It is not, we are ethically justified to use violent means, but the question then is, does it make sense? Do we have the right technology? Do we have the right arms? Are people ready to struggle? Those are the kind of questions I think should guide us. Having a kind of scientific analysis around how and who our enemy is, who our target is, if those means work. Otherwise, it might mean, yes, peaceful struggle. It might mean boycotting. It might mean doing those things. But what I learned from studying various wars and warfares across generation is that it really is a combination according to the needs of the time, and that's really the kind of thing that we have to understand, that is often not going to be this generation that's going to, you might have laid the groundwork, it might be 3 generations who might be able to be the ones who strike the final blow, but all of that is part of a continuum that is ultimately going to chip, or eventually, hopefully, sort of David and Goliath against empire and set the colonial rule.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Yeah. I think we can bring it to an end now, and I was just going to end with V.Y. Mudimbe, who, again, we planted a tree for today, the Congolese philosopher. And he wrote The Idea of Africa and the Invention of Africa. And what he does say is that the invention of Africa is as foil to Europe. So we do all the bad stuff in Africa to make Europe look good. So I think on that note, I'd like to ask you to thank our panelists, please, Joe Sacco, and Panashe, for a stimulating, enlightening, frank discussion over difficult topics this evening. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.